You woke up rich, then went to bed broke. Seriously, it sounds like massive hyperbole, right? But no, this was the terrifying reality of a sudden, brutal crash that wiped out an estimated $200 billion almost overnight in today's money. I mean, just imagine the sheer shock of that. There were no warning sirens, no physical wars suddenly breaking out on American soil that morning. It was just this invisible financial earthquake that completely shattered a decade of unprecedented optimism. But hey, to understand how we fell so hard, we first got to look at how high we were flying.
Section 1. The Roaring Twenties Boom. Picture this. It's the post-World War I jazz age, and the economy is absolutely vibing. The war is over, the troops are home, and factories that were busy building tanks and military gear just a few years prior suddenly shifted gears to pump out consumer goods. And Henry Ford's moving assembly line was a total, literal game changer here. What used to take 12 agonizing hours to build suddenly took 90 minutes. Because of that, by 1924, the price of a Model T dropped to just $290. Suddenly, cars, radios, vacuum cleaners, they weren't just for the ultra-rich anymore. They were totally affordable for the average citizen. By 1927, they were rolling the 15 millionth Model T off the line. This put the American economy into absolute overdrive, dragging huge industries like steel, oil, and rubber right up with it.
But wait, how were all these average citizens actually paying for these fancy new luxuries? Well, enter a brand new, extremely popular concept: buy now, pay later. Installment plans became the absolute norm. Want a radio? Finance it. Want a car? Finance it. The banks were eating this up, practically throwing credit at anyone with a pulse. But here's where it gets sketchy. The real danger wasn't financing a washing machine. The danger was that people started using this exact same logic to buy stocks with money they didn't actually have. Get this, by 1929, a staggering 40% of all U.S. consumer debt was tied up entirely in stock market speculation. 40%! People were buying stocks on margin. That means you could put down just 10% of the cash yourself and literally borrow the other 90%. Everyone from your barber to your butcher thought they were the next big Wall Street tycoon. Stock prices basically broke completely free from actual economic fundamentals. They quadrupled in value over just a few years, entirely fueled by borrowed cash and this unshakable blind optimism.
Section 2. Black Tuesday and the Crash. But by late 1929, behind all the jazz and the flowing champagne, consumer demand was actually quietly slowing down. Companies were overproducing goods, and agriculture was really struggling. The floorboards were rotting, The illusion of endless growth was just about to shatter. In late October, investors got seriously spooked, and the selling began. On Black Thursday, the market fell 11%. But then came Black Tuesday, and it was just outright chaotic panic. The market dropped another 12%. A record 16.4 million shares were dumped in a single day. The selling was so incredibly fast and furious that the ticker tapes literally couldn't keep up with the volume. People didn't even know the prices they were selling at. Massive chunks of paper wealth simply vanished into thin air.
Section 3. The banking system collapse.
Now, you might be thinking the stock market crash was the Great Depression, right? Actually, it was really just the trigger. The true disaster, the one that destroyed everyday people who never even owned a single stock, lay hidden in the fragile, over-leveraged banking system. These dominoes fell ridiculously fast. First, margin calls hit. Brokers demanded that remaining 90% of the stock prices from investors who basically had nothing left. Second, realizing their banks were holding millions in worthless loans, terrified citizens rushed to pull their life savings out. We're talking massive, chaotic, mass bank runs. Third, because banks actually lend out most of their cash, they quickly ran completely out of money and simply collapsed. Over 9,000 banks failed. 9 million savings accounts were just gone. Poof. And fourth, with people hoarding cash and banks terrified to lend a dime, the U.S. money supply shrank by a massive 31%. This triggered crushing deflation. Businesses were forced to slash prices, fire workers, and permanently shut their doors.
Section 4. A Global Economic Crisis. But hey, this wasn't just an American tragedy. By the 1920s, the world had already become this deeply interconnected web of trade networks and international debt. So, the second American banks panicked, they immediately called in their overseas loans. And that led to wildly varied suffering across the globe. Down in Latin America, which relied really heavily on exporting raw materials, commodity prices dropped by up to 66%. It got so bad in Brazil that the government actually burned 60 million bags of coffee. Literally burned them, just to artificially restrict the supply and bump up prices. Over in Europe, Nations slapped on strict austerity measures and massive tariffs that only choked global trade even further. In Africa and Asia, peasant farmers relying on cash crops suddenly couldn't pay these crushing colonial taxes, so a lot of them were forced off their land and into low-wage colonial mines. But interestingly, Japan took a vastly different route. They aggressively transitioned to heavy industry and quickly devalued their currency, which actually let them bounce back incredibly fast.
So why did some nations recover while others just languished? A lot of it came down to currency. The gold standard required countries to hold physical gold to back their money. This severely constrained their ability to print cash, which ultimately fueled that massive deflation we talked about. But nations that aggressively ditched this rigid standard in favor of fiat money, like Japan and eventually the UK, were able to print money, devalue their currency, make their exports way cheaper on the global stage, and essentially boost their economies right out of the rut. The countries that stubbornly clung to gold, they suffered the longest.
Section 5. Despair and the Dust Bowl. Let's step away from the macroeconomic charts for a second, because the immense desperation on a human level in the 1930s was just absolutely devastating. Behind every single one of those statistics was a family struggling just to survive. We are talking about a 25% unemployment rate in the US. 34 million people were left with absolutely zero income. With homes foreclosed and savings entirely wiped out, makeshift shanty towns built out of scrap wood and cardboard began popping up all across the country. They were grimly nicknamed Hoovervilles, after President Hoover. People completely lost faith in their institutions. It got so bad that when a group of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, peacefully marched on Washington demanding their promised service bonuses a bit early, the government literally responded with tear gas and military force. It was true rock bottom. And as if a total economic collapse wasn't quite enough, nature unleashed its own wrath. The Dust Bowl was a sheer apocalyptic event. Decades of really aggressive farming had completely stripped the topsoil across the American Great Plains. So when a severe drought hit, the winds just picked up all that loose dirt, creating massive black blizzards. These towering, terrifying storms of dust buried crops, suffocated livestock, and literally blotted out the sun. It was a completely man-made ecological disaster that compounded the misery, forcing millions of rural farmers to pack up their broken-down cars and flee westward in a desperate search for survival. Section 6. Reform, Recovery, and War. So how in the world did we ever dig ourselves out of this massive hole? Well, the climb back up was incredibly arduous, marked by a massive, completely unprecedented shift in government intervention and ultimately a tragic shift in global politics. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and immediately rolled out the New Deal. The government spun up massive public works programs to give young men shovels, paychecks, and a desperately needed sense of purpose. Crucially, they really focused on restoring trust. FDR established the FDIC to ensure bank deposits and the SEC to act as the police for Wall Street. Then, in 1935, Social Security was created to finally provide a safety net for the elderly. But here's the catch. Even with all these massive stimulus efforts, the economy didn't fully bounce back right away. It actually wasn't until 1939, when the mobilization for World War II sparked a massive industrial boom, that full employment truly returned. One global tragedy ironically ended by the start of another.
But the structural guardrails we rely on today, they were quite literally born from the ashes of this very depression. Deposit insurance from the FDIC means you no longer have to sprint down to your local bank in a panic to withdraw your savings at the first sign of trouble. The SEC now enforces actual rules on what used to be the Wild West of the stock market. We also saw a permanent global shift toward Keynesian economics, meaning governments now actively step in to stimulate the economy during a crisis, rather than just stepping back and letting it crash. And of course, this era marked the permanent end of the rigid global gold standard in favor of the flexible fiat currencies we all use today.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Have we finally learned to control fear, greed, and speculation? Today, we've got sophisticated safety nets, heavily regulated markets, and central banks ready to intervene at a moment's notice. But as we've seen, underneath all the fancy charts and complex policies, economies are ultimately driven by human psychology. The Roaring '20s were built on the fundamental belief that the good times would never ever end, entirely fueled by debt and blind optimism. So, looking at our modern financial world right now, ask yourself, are we truly immune to the same human flaws that caused the greatest financial disaster in history? Or are fear and greed just waiting for their next big opportunity? I hope this explainer gave you some really valuable historical perspective. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the world around you.